The Japanese soldier walked toward the American lines expecting to be shot. He had made his decision an hour earlier, lying in the dark of a collapsed bunker, starving, feverish, the last survivor of his unit, and it was the hardest decision of his life. Not because he feared death. He had been ready to die for years. It was hard because everything he was, everything he had been raised to believe, told him that what he was about to do was worse than death. He was going to surrender. And as he stumbled into the open with his hands raised, half blind in the sunlight, he was certain of exactly one thing. The Americans were going to torture him, and then they were going to kill him. That was not cowardice talking. It was everything he had ever been taught by every authority he had ever known. And so, when the American Marines surrounded him, these huge, loud men he had been told were devils, he closed his eyes and waited for the end. Instead, someone put a canteen of water in his hands. Then someone else looked at the infected wound on his leg, called for a medic, and began, carefully, almost gently, to clean it. And the Japanese soldier began to weep. Not from relief, not yet. From something far more confusing. The complete collapse of everything he understood about the world. This is not the story of a battle. It is the story of the strangest and least told transformation of the Pacific War. What happened to Japanese soldiers after the moment of surrender inside American hands. It is a story almost no one tells, because so few men lived it. And that is exactly why it matters. Here is the question that should stop you. The Japanese soldier was, by training and belief, perhaps the most surrender-proof fighting man in modern history. A soldier who would starve, charge hopeless positions, or take his own life rather than be captured. So, what happened inside the mind of the rare man who did fall into American hands alive, and discovered that every single thing he had been promised about his enemy was a lie? What does it do to a man to be saved by the people he was told were monsters? To understand that, you have to start with the belief itself. And you have to take it seriously, because it was one of the most powerful ideas any army has ever instilled in its men. In the Imperial Japanese military, surrender was not merely discouraged. It was unthinkable. A disgrace so absolute that it erased a man's honor, his family's honor, and his very identity. The military code that shaped every recruit taught that a soldier must never live to endure the shame of capture. Death in battle was glory. Death by one's own hand was dignity. Capture was annihilation of the soul. This was not abstract philosophy. It was drilled into men until it became reflex. And it worked. Across the entire Pacific War, Japanese units fought and died, almost literally to the last man, on island after island, in numbers that stunned every Western observer. Where other armies might surrender by the thousands when a battle was clearly lost, Japanese garrisons died at rates above 95%. The handful taken alive were very often men too badly wounded or too deeply unconscious to resist. And woven through that code was a second belief, just as powerful. A picture of the American enemy as a monster. Japanese soldiers were told, over and over, that capture meant torture, that the Americans mutilated prisoners, that they killed the men who surrendered, that falling into their hands alive was a fate worse than any death the battlefield could offer. Better to die by your own grenade than to let the devils take you. On island after island, this belief drove not only soldiers, but, in some terrible cases, civilians to choose death over capture, one of the great tragedies of the entire war. Now, honesty demands something here, and it matters more in this story than in almost any other. The Pacific War was a war of extraordinary mutual brutality, and the Japanese soldiers' fear was not conjured from nothing. It was a savage theater on both sides. Real atrocities against Allied prisoners in Japanese hands, including the death marches, the prison camps, and the executions, had hardened American troops, And there were ugly moments, especially early in the war and in the heat of combat, when surrendering Japanese were shot, sometimes out of rage, sometimes out of genuine fear, because feigned surrender had been used as a weapon, and men had died learning it. No honest telling of this story pretends otherwise. The Pacific was not a gentleman's war, and neither side came out of it clean. But that is precisely what makes what happened next so remarkable. Because once a Japanese prisoner made it past the chaos of the battlefield and into the formal custody of the American military, into the aid stations, the stockades, the ships, and the camps, he entered a system that had made a deliberate, official choice. Prisoners would be treated according to the international conventions. Fed, sheltered, given medical care, protected. Not because every American soldier felt warmth toward a hated enemy, most did not, but because that was the policy of the United States, applied even to the army that had not extended the same mercy to Americans. And for the Japanese soldier who experienced it, that policy did not feel like policy. It felt like the ground opening under his feet. Go back to that weeping man with the canteen in his hands, because his tears are the center of this whole story. Understand what is happening inside him in that moment. He has just committed, in his own mind, the worst act of his life. He believes he has destroyed his honor, disgraced his family, and ceased, in the eyes of everything he was raised in, to be fully a man. He expects the monsters to do what monsters do. And instead, the first thing the monsters do is give him water and treat his wounds. The cruelty he was promised does not come. It keeps not coming. Hour after hour, day after day, the torture he braced for never arrives, and in its place there is food and medicine and shelter and something he has no framework for at all. Enemies, treating him like a human being at the exact moment he believes he has stopped deserving to be one. Some men broke down completely. Interrogators and camp personnel described prisoners who wept, who could not stop bowing, who asked again and again why they were being fed, why they were being healed, what the Americans wanted from them. The answer, that this was simply how prisoners were to be treated, was, for many of them, the single most destabilizing piece of information they received in the entire war. Because if the Americans were not monsters, then the men who had told them the Americans were monsters had lied. And if they had lied about that, what else had they lied about? Before we go deeper into what happened to these men, I want to stop for just a moment and hear from you, because this history belongs to the people watching it as much as to anyone. Wherever you are in the world right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. And if you served, or your father or your grandfather did, in the Pacific or anywhere else, tell me that too. And tell me the part of this history you're most passionate about. I read every one, and it means more than you know to see who's out there. Now, back to those prisoners, because what the Americans discovered about them next surprised everyone, on both sides. Here is the strange paradox that emerged in the interrogation tents, and it caught American intelligence officers completely off guard. The Japanese military had trained its men so absolutely never to surrender that it had never trained them for what to do if they were captured. Other armies taught their soldiers resistance techniques. Give only your name, rank, and number. Reveal nothing. Assume capture is part of war. The Japanese soldier had received no such training, because to prepare a man for capture was to admit capture was possible. And so, when capture happened anyway, many prisoners found themselves in a psychological free fall, with no doctrine to hold on to. In their own minds, the men they had been were already dead. The soldier who was captured had, in a sense, ceased to exist, and some prisoners, adrift in that void, responded in a way no one predicted. They cooperated, openly, sometimes eagerly. American interrogators who spoke Japanese and, crucially, treated the prisoners with courtesy, discovered that men who had fought with suicidal ferocity days earlier would now answer questions with startling frankness, describe positions and units, even offer help. Not universally and not simply, but often enough to matter, and for a reason that says everything about the collapse they had undergone. The old world that had commanded their loyalty had, by its own rules, already cast them out. The new world in front of them, the one giving them rice and cigarettes and medical care, was the only one still treating them as men. Some prisoners later said they felt they had died on the battlefield and been reborn as someone else. And a reborn man, treated decently by the enemy who was supposed to devour him, often decided that his loyalty had died with his old self. It is worth pausing on the men who sat across the table from these prisoners, because the American approach to interrogation was itself part of the story, and it was the opposite of everything the prisoner expected. The interrogators who worked the Pacific were, in large numbers, Japanese Americans, young men whose own families, in one of the war's bitter ironies, had in many cases been uprooted and confined back home, and who nonetheless volunteered to serve, translating documents, crawling toward cave mouths with loudspeakers, and sitting down day after day with the enemy. They spoke the prisoner's language not just literally but culturally. They understood what surrender had cost him. And the method they used, refined across the war, was not the fist and the threat the prisoner had braced for. It was tea, conversation, courtesy, questions about his home, his family, his hunger, respect, offered to a man drowning in shame. The effect of that courtesy on a man expecting torture is difficult to overstate. Prisoner after prisoner, disarmed by simple decency, opened up to these interrogators in ways that brute force could never have achieved, and the intelligence they provided saved American lives on the next island, and the one after that. The American way, it turned out, worked better even at the interrogation table. The army that was supposed to torture its captives instead poured them tea, and learned more by it than cruelty ever would have. And for the prisoner, those conversations were often the first time in his adult life that an authority figure had asked him what he thought and listened. More than one man later said that it was in those quiet talks with an enemy who treated him like a human being that he first began to imagine what a different kind of world might look like. Zoom out for a moment, because this quiet phenomenon had loud consequences. The intelligence gathered from cooperative Japanese prisoners, and from the diaries and documents recovered alongside them, became one of the underappreciated American advantages of the Pacific War. And it created a feedback loop that American commanders came to understand very clearly. Prisoners were more valuable alive than dead. As the war went on, frontline troops were pushed with leaflets and orders and incentives to take prisoners rather than finish off the wounded, not purely as a moral matter, but as a hard-nosed military one. Every man brought in alive and treated well was a potential window into the enemy's positions and living proof to other Japanese soldiers that the promise of torture was a lie. That proof mattered because the Americans put it to work. Leaflets rained down on Japanese positions across the Pacific, millions of them, carrying photographs of prisoners alive, unharmed, eating, and messages promising fair treatment to any man who came in. For most of the war, the code held and the leaflets were ignored or used as cigarette paper. But as the war ground toward its end, as starvation and hopelessness ate at isolated garrisons, the trickle of surrenders grew. And every man who came in and was fed instead of shot became another crack in the wall, another witness whose survival contradicted everything the Imperial military had promised. And picture, finally, the other side of that long chain, the moment where it all began, out on some starving island in the last year of the war. A Japanese soldier crouches in the jungle, down to a handful of rice a day, his unit dissolving around him from hunger and disease, the Americans' loudspeakers echoing off the hills. A piece of paper has blown against the roots beside him, one of the millions of leaflets the Americans have scattered over the island. He has been ordered, on pain of death, not to read these things. He reads it anyway, in the dark, the way a starving man reads a menu. It shows a photograph. Japanese soldiers, men like him, alive, not mutilated, not kneeling before executioners, sitting in the sun, fed, whole, some of them almost smiling. The text promises what every fiber of his training tells him is impossible: food, medicine, fair treatment, life. He does not believe it. Of course he does not believe it. He has been inoculated against exactly this. But he is starving, and the photograph does not look like a lie. And somewhere beneath all his training, a question he cannot silence has begun to whisper. What if it is true? For most men, the question was not enough. The code held, and they died with it. But for some, on some night near the end, hunger and the whisper won. They folded the leaflet into a pocket, and they walked toward the enemy lines with their hands up, betting their lives on the possibility that everything they had ever been taught was wrong. They won that bet. Every one of them who made it in discovered that the photograph had been the truth, and the doctrine had been the lie. And each of them became, in turn, part of the next photograph, living proof, for the next starving man reading a leaflet in the dark, that the monsters were not monsters at all. Now, bring it down again, to one man, in one camp, because this is where the transformation completed itself. Picture a Japanese prisoner months after his capture, in a camp far behind the lines, in Hawaii, in Australia, in the continental United States. He has gained back the weight the jungle took from him. His wounds have healed, treated by enemy doctors. He has clothes, a cot, regular meals, the same scale of rations, under the rules, as the soldiers guarding him. He plays baseball, of all things, in a dusty yard with other prisoners. He has learned that the guards, whom he was taught to see as devils, are mostly bored young men who toss him cigarettes and try out clumsy Japanese phrases and laugh with him rather than at him. Nothing about his existence matches anything he was told. And in the quiet of the evenings, he is doing the hardest work of his life, rebuilding, from the ground up, his entire understanding of what is true. Because that is what this story is really about. Not comfort, comprehension. The Japanese prisoner's world had been built on a foundation of absolute claims: the divine cause, the invincible spirit, the bestial enemy, the disgrace of capture. Every one of those claims had now been tested against reality in the most personal way possible, and everyone had failed. The cause had led his unit to annihilation on an island whose name meant nothing. The invincible spirit had been buried under American steel. The bestial enemy had bandaged his leg, and the disgrace of capture had turned out to be life. Ordinary, continuing, undeserved life, handed to him by the people he had been taught to fear most. Some men never recovered from that collapse, and carried the shame of survival for the rest of their days. That, too, is part of the truth, and it deserves respect. But many others walked out of it, changed in a way that no bullet and no bomb could ever have changed them. They had seen, with their own eyes, that the enemy was human, and that the lie they had been raised on had nearly cost them the chance to ever know it. And when the war finally ended, these men became something no one had planned for: witnesses. Tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners were eventually repatriated to a defeated, occupied homeland, and they came home carrying first-hand knowledge that cut directly against everything the wartime state had preached. They had been in the belly of the beast, and the beast had fed them. In the years of the American occupation of Japan, an occupation that itself stunned the Japanese public with its restraint and its efforts at rebuilding, the returned prisoners' quiet testimony joined a larger national reckoning. The devils had come, and they had brought food and medicine, and, in time, a constitution. The transformation of Japan and America from the bitterest of enemies into one of the closest alliances in the world did not begin with a treaty. It began in thousands of small moments scattered across the Pacific, with a canteen of water pressed into the hands of a man who expected a bayonet. There is one more layer to this, and it is the one that should land hardest for an American audience. The decency shown to Japanese prisoners was not repaid in kind, and the Americans knew it. Throughout the war, reports and rumors of what was happening to Allied prisoners in Japanese hands filtered back. The starvation, the beatings, the death marches, the men worked to death on railways and in mines. American soldiers knew, or sensed, that their captured friends were living a nightmare. And still, as a matter of national policy, the United States fed and healed and protected the soldiers of the army responsible. Not because it was easy, not because the enemy deserved it, but because the Americans had decided that how they treated the helpless, even a hated, unrepentant enemy, was a statement about who they were, not about who the enemy was. That is a hard standard to hold in the middle of a savage war. It was not held perfectly. No honest history claims it was. But it was held, officially and overwhelmingly, in the camps and the stockades and the hospital ships, and every Japanese soldier who lived through it became, whether he wanted to or not, a witness to the difference. Come back, at the end, to the man who walked out of the bunker with his hands raised, certain he was choosing torture and death. Everything he believed told him the Americans would prove the propaganda true. Instead, a Marine handed him water, and a medic knelt over his wound, and the world he had been given by his leaders quietly fell apart around him, replaced, over months, by one he had to build himself out of what he had actually seen. He had been taught that his enemy had no soul. His enemy healed him. He had been taught that capture would destroy him. Capture was the thing that let him live. And he wept that first day, not because he was weak, but because no man can watch the deepest certainties of his life collapse in an afternoon and feel nothing. In the end, the rarest victory America won in the Pacific was not on a beach or a carrier deck. It was in the minds of the few enemy soldiers who fell into its hands alive. Men raised on the promise that Americans were monsters, who then spent months being quietly, stubbornly proven wrong by the monsters themselves. Japan taught its soldiers that capture was worse than death. America taught the captured that the lesson itself was the lie. And of all the weapons deployed in that vast and terrible war, none delivered a more permanent verdict than a canteen of water, offered without cruelty, to an enemy who had been promised he would never receive one.